Just dip into the ThIs Now Summit, where we have Dr. Arvind Panagariya talking.
State in which it is on the way to becoming a leading power. First of all, it is a rare example of a developing country which has sustained democracy for more than 75 years now. It's difficult if you think about it, perhaps Costa Rica, perhaps Jamaica, but very few, countries which after Second World War became independent and were developing countries have sustained democracy for that long. That is important because, in democracy, consensus building takes time, but once consensus has been built up, it also sustains. Unlike authoritarian regimes where, change of leaders can really create upheavals, as, for example, we are witnessing currently in China. So that's one fact. Second is that we have now sustained economic reforms for about 33 years. So a lot of the reforms that were required and required consensus building are now in place. And there is also largely consensus in place for some of the outstanding reforms about which we can speak later. But the road for those reforms is perhaps cleaner and clearer than it was 30 years ago. Third factor I would point out is that timing from India's point of view is absolutely fantastic. Now, among the major economies, there are no competitors, so to say, because really, US and Europe, these are mature economies, which probably would grow 2%, 3% at the most. China, which would have been the major competitor, has done kind of its major innings. If you look at the record of the countries that have grown rapidly, like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, in the past, at the end of the day, generally this kind of very rapid growth happens for 3 decades. After fourth decade, in the fourth decade, you'd come down to, from 8 to 10%, you come down to 6%, 5%. And then in the fifth decade, you're to 3 or 4%. So not only the fact that somehow the leadership in China has taken a very different turn, which is not very growth friendly, but also I think, in terms of its own evolution, it has now arrived at a place where its growth rate is bound to decline. So it really leaves India as the only major economy. And I suppose I should add a fourth factor, which is that today India's base with about $3.6 trillion is large enough. I think for a while, for us, the base was so small that even a growth of 7, 8, 9% really added not enough. But now it can. So I think all these factors really are working for India, and not to mention the fact that, there is very able leadership at the center, and in many of the states as well. So all this is adding up to make India really unstoppable.
Right. So, Mr. Panagariya, are you saying that China, because you mentioned about China, that as far as growth possibilities are concerned, they have already peaked out? Because the general belief about India is that India's Amrit Kal has just begun, and next 2 to 3 decades are actually going to drive a huge amount of momentum towards making India a developed nation by 2047. So is that happening in tandem, in sync, that China is slowing down and India is picking up pace just at the right time?
Yes, I think, that was the gist of what I said. Another way to look at it is that, in terms of per capita income, we're still below $3,000, about somewhere 2,500 roughly or so. That means that the gap between our per capita income and what other countries have achieved is extremely large. And this is, what that says is that even with the existing technologies, as we accumulate more capital over time, we can actually raise the productivity levels, the average worker productivity levels, to significantly higher levels. I mean, you can compare with you can compare with China, where this per capita income is somewhere between $13,000-$14,000, compare with South Korea, which is $32,000-$33,000. That's a very large gap. And what we know is that this is doable with the existing technologies. And with our kind of gap, it really places us in a great place. In addition, with all the reforms in place, it paves the way. In some ways, these gaps existed, perhaps even larger gaps existed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even 80s. But then the economic reforms were not in place. The economic activity was so incredibly restricted through all sorts of licensing systems. Investment was subject to licensing, imports were subject to licensing, everything was controlled. So the entrepreneurs really didn't have a free play. Today the entrepreneurs have a free play. Economy is open, so investment is coming in, technology can flow in. So in effect, and everybody has to compete with the best in the world. And that also actually brings the best out of you. So all these factors, I think, add up for us for next 2 to 3 decades, perhaps even longer, to sustain a very rapid growth. I mean, we are currently growing, in real rupees, about 7% or so per year. It's certainly, with a few more reforms in the next 5 years, I think we can realistically push it to somewhere, close to 9%, certainly somewhere between 8 to 9%. And that can be sustained easily for a couple of decades, and then when the growth rate does decline, as it has happened in the case of all the other countries, we will still be maintaining possibly at 6 or 7%.
Right. So, sir, I want to understand, if things are so promising and there is a lot of optimism globally about India's potential, obviously some part of it stems from the fact that there is risk aversion about slightly unpredictable regimes like China or what is happening in Russia, as we witnessed. Why there is this constant question mark coming about India's growth potential from some of the experts, some Indian as well as some global, and you have commented about some of them in the past as well. But some people call India's GDP numbers mystifying. Some people say that they are not able to decipher India's growth prospects and the growth data which we are presenting and projecting. What is your view on that?
Well, if you are mystified, first you have to check whether the mist is on your own glasses you are wearing or somewhere else. I mean, I see no reason there is a very professional class of statisticians which MOSPI, which is the agency tasked with measuring GDP,